Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. And tonight, I'm going to talk about a topic that was a discriminatory practice. Again, it was a discriminatory practice against African Americans when it came to housing. And I'm going to talk about redlining. And that was the practice to keep African Americans from moving into Caucasian neighborhoods. In fact, so many African American communities like Tulsa, like Minneapolis, Minnesota, had interstates built through them. Now, I know it's Black History Month, but I want to say this. I know Black people, we talk about each other, but have to take a moment, think about what Black people have done. If it weren't for civil rights, I don't believe any of these other movements would have taken place because other movements like the feminist movement, like the LGBTQ movement, all these other movements piggyback off of the civil rights movement. And one aspect of the civil rights movement was housing. I know we don't talk about that. And right around 1931, I believe, that's when the FHA was developed because you had a number of developers who had warranty deeds that said no Mongolians, Chinese, or Turkish, anyone other than Caucasians. Now, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to talk about redlining here. All right. What is redlining, first of all? Well, it's the practice of denying people access to credit because of where they're living. Even if they're personally qualified for loans, historically, mortgage lenders once widely redlined poor urban neighborhoods and Black populated neighborhoods in particular. Now, in 1968, let me make a correction. I said 1931. It was 1968. What happened was the Fair Housing Act outlawed racially motivated redlining and tasked federal financial regulators, including the Federal Reserve, with enforcement. Now, however, before 1968, the federal government did play a key role in institutionalizing and encouraging redlining through the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. Now, let me go back and look at a bit of history. Okay, the FHA was the architect that federally sponsored redlining from 1934 until the 1960s. Other federal agencies, such as the Federal Reserve, regulated the banks and thrifts that originated or bought FHA insured loans. Of the interactions between the Federal Reserve and the FHA, not much has been written. Fed Chair Mariner Eccles was intimately involved in drafting the legislation that created the FHA. What little record, there was little record of his views about the FHA's redlining practices. So one biographer of Eccles concluded that redlining was one major failing of the FHA that Eccles and very few others at the time even bothered to mention. Now, what happened at that time, FHA was tasked with ensuring economically sound loans as part of an overhaul system of residential mortgage finance that had been decimated by the Depression. The FHA began redlining at the beginning of its operations in 1934 as FHA staff concluded that no loan could be economically sound if the property was located in a neighborhood that was or could become populated by Black people as property values might decline over the life of 15, 20 years. And of course, 15 to 20-year loans were attempting to standardize. Now, for example, the FHA's 1938 underwriting manual emphasized the negative impact of infiltration of inharmonious racial groups on credit risk. So basically, to limit that risk, it recommended restrictive covenants that prohibit the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were attended, which had become increasingly common in the 1920s. Now, for the next few decades, the FHA generally favored loans on new construction in suburban areas rather than urban areas with older housing stocks or Black residents. Now, prior to the creation of the FHA, many banks were highly restricted in the amount of mortgage loans they were allowed to make. Now, mortgage loans were historically considered risky by those who had crafted federal banking law. Now, regulators, as such as the Federal Reserve, feared that banks could be unable to pay depositors on demand if their funds were locked up in mortgages, especially since the secondary market for mortgages was limited historically. So basically, the advent of FHA insurance in the 1930s led to new federal bank regulations. And what happened, that encouraged banks to hold FHA insured loans. Now, FHA insured loans were basically viewed as relatively safe given the federal insurance and because the uniform nature of FHA insured loans supported a secondary market that made the loans relatively easy if needed. Now, here's something as well. As a result, the banks originated roughly half of the mortgages insured by the Federal Housing Administration from 1935 to 1941. Now, let's go back to something as well. I mentioned the FHA. Now, the FHA, now let's go back to some dates here so we don't get them twisted. Okay. The Federal Housing Administration was started in the early 30s. Now, the FHA Act took place in 1968. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, if you think about during that time, what was happening during that time? Well, 1929, there was the Depression. And if you think about it, in the 30s, starting in 1933, World War II was beginning. Now, the Americans hadn't jumped into World War II as of yet. Now, the FHA and redlining, it's really going to have some importance after World War II because a lot of people were moving out to the suburbs. This is when subdivisions, and this is when you had a lot of the baby boomers. So let me get back to the topic, and I'll give my commentary at the end. So, policy. Well, federal policy reflected segregation in American society at large. While the FHA institutionalized redlining, the practice did not originate with the federal government, and public and private redlining were basically fundamentally intertwined. Now, the Fair Housing Act in 1968 basically it banned all discrimination in real estate and mortgage lending, including racially motivated redlining. Now, there were people that were moving into white neighborhoods. Again, I just saw a documentary on what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, also Glassboro, New Jersey. White folk were actually paying Black people to move out of their neighborhood. They didn't want Black people in their neighborhoods because they thought Black people were going to bring down the property value. Now, something that happened in the 30s and the 40s, and this is where you saw a rise of what we call the projects or we call them public housing. Well, again, following the Act's passage, the Federal Reserve and other regulators, they took a series of steps toward implementing the Act's provisions directed at discrimination in real estate lending. Now, by 1971, the Federal Reserve's efforts included training for bank examiners and basically requiring the banks that it regulated to post equal housing lender information in its lobbies. Now, the Federal Reserve improved these functions over time as it took steps to identify shortcomings and in response to feedback. Now, for example, the Board of Governors hired a consultant who, in 1978, issued a report describing mild hostility by examiners to civil rights compliance and hesitance by the board to unambiguously commit itself to vigorously enforce or prioritize civil rights laws. So, in response, in the late 1970s, the board determined that this enforcement was not sufficiently comprehensive or forceful, and it strengthened it in several ways. Now, the board created a specialized enforcement program, a formal process to promptly respond to complaints, and several other measures. So, here's what happened. Both the board and the reserve banks also added staff that specialized in civil rights. Meanwhile, community groups continued to assemble evidence that lenders remain engaged in redlining, in part based on data made available through the 1974 Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. 1977, the Congress passed the Community Reinvestment Act to affirm the obligation for federally regulated financial institutions such as banks to reinvest in the low and moderate income communities where they operate consistently with safe and sound operation. Now, altogether, these reforms help end redlining as a widespread legal practice, even as community groups continue to protest lingering financial inclusion issues. So, basically, community groups also push the board to use their available powers. One flashpoint came in 1975 when the board concerns that Marine Midland Bank was not serving the convenience and the needs of the communities where its banks were based. Now, the board resisted using its authority under the Bank Holding Company Act, which is known as the BHCA, to achieve favored social objectives. So basically, 2 years later, when the CRA, which is the Community Reinvestment Act, was under consideration, Arthur Burns would testify that the Fed already had this authority it needed under the BHCA to consider whether the banks were meeting the credit needs of their communities. So basically, the passage of the CRA, again, which is the Community Reinforcement Act in 1977, basically it prompted the Fed to change its approach. So under the CRA, federal agencies encourage lenders to help meet local credit needs in a manner consistent with safe and sound operation and assesses lenders' records of doing so. So, to facilitate compliance of lenders with the CRA, the Federal Reserve established its community development function in the early 1980s. Since then, this function has evolved to promote the economic development of low and moderate income communities by studying what works and sharing practice, informed research with lenders and community groups. So basically, today, the Federal Reserve policy continues to be informed by the long lasting legacy of public and private redlining. So the Federal Reserve has reserved several instances of redlining to law enforcement and continues to enforce fair lending laws. Chairman Powell has described the Fed's robust supervisory approach as critical to addressing racial discrimination. So in 2022, federal banking regulators issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to amend the implementation of the Community Reinforcement Act or Reinvestment Act, that's the Community Reinvestment Act, to ensure that the law is effective in supporting a robust and inclusive financial services industry. Now, again, we're dealing with redlining. Now, if you hear the dates that I just mentioned, we already dealt with Jim Crow laws that started in the late 1800s and particularly lasted in the 60s and 70s in the South. But if you think about it, we talked about the Federal Housing Agency, FHA. We talked about the Fair Housing Act. The federal government got involved. It didn't do anything about redlining. And if you think about it, we're still talking about it. Now, back in 08, you had Countrywide, some of these other lenders, they were actually lending money to people who weren't qualified. And the people who weren't qualified couldn't pay the loans back. Now, again, when it came to property, there was a lot of discrimination going on. And I will say this about African American people. When it comes to segregation, there are some cities that are still segregated out there. Chicago is a segregated city. Baltimore is a segregated city. The problem that Black people have is, and James Brown mentioned it in his documentary, he mentioned that we have to build our own banks. Now, some people criticize James Brown for buying radio stations and restaurants, but he tried it. You look at Tulsa, Oklahoma. You look at a lot of these other Black Wall Streets out there. Black people did try, but they kept on getting stomped on by the lower class Caucasian people. Now, again, this is not about racism here, but redlining, it did take place. And I just want you to know that there were discriminatory practices when it came to African Americans trying to get home loans, mortgages. Share my screen again, and let's go to some YouTube. And we're going to talk about some of these and these practices when it came to redlining. Fair use, fair use. You're going to learn in some of these videos how redlining came to be and how it took place and where it is today. So, without further ado, this is for educational purposes only. Fair use.
In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. So I want to talk about redlining because this is a term you may have heard, but most people don't actually know the history. In 1933, in the midst of America's Great Depression, when unemployment rates were 25% and millions of people were not only out of work, but many of them were houseless, the federal government, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, established an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Basically, it tried to make home buying much more affordable by subsidizing the cost of building and lending such that people would be able to afford to buy for the first time. Millions of Americans participated, except that when the Homeowners Loan Corporation began to issue mortgages, it came up with a scheme to decide which communities were deserving of loans and which ones weren't. They made maps and used a color-coded scheme. Green meant this was a community that you could lend to, and red meant you could not. The basic decision they made was to determine that any community with the presence of Black people or brown people or people who perhaps spoke Italian in certain parts of the country could not receive support from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This created a system that came to be known as redlining because communities that were deemed risky by the mere presence of people of color, most especially black people, were disqualified from getting direct support from the federal government to purchase homes. This policy lasted until 1968 when the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, which made all forms of discrimination in the buying and selling or renting of homes illegal. But the truth is that the legacies of redlining from that moment to the present meant that black people were subjected to other forms of exploitative lending. A system called contract buying grew up as a way to sell black people homes on a layaway plan. You made set payments over an extended period of time, but you never owned the home until the very last payment. It was very common for unscrupulous sellers to withhold that final payment in an effort to take back the home from a person who had worked incredibly hard to buy it. Home ownership has been the most important asset that a typical white family has in order to do simple things like borrow money to send a child to college. But most importantly, they have financial freedom. But for communities that have been subjected to redlining, they didn't have those advantages. Not only that, the very communities that they lived in suffered from divestment, including the lack of grocery stores, the lack of businesses, the imposition of federal highways that often bisected their communities. In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. And to this day, the median wages and income of those communities and the financial insecurity that people who live in redlined communities face has long-term health consequences for families, has educational consequences for young people whose schools often don't have the tax basis to give them the same resources that communities that were never redlined actually have.
Fair use.
At the end of the Great Depression, during the Roosevelt administration, the banks were extremely wary of lending any money. The unemployment rate was so high and the inflation rates were so high. In order to encourage the banks to begin lending once again, the federal government comes up with this tool that we now call redlining. And it was a series of maps. And the maps were intended to indicate to the banks where high and low risk were in order to lend credit in the form of a mortgage. So risk at that point in the 1930s, through the 1940s, through the 1950s, in American society was based on race. In those least risky neighborhoods, on maps they were coded green, and mortgages were available to those places at very low interest rates. In the most risky neighborhoods, which were non-white neighborhoods, they were coded red on maps, which is where the term redlining comes from. And in those neighborhoods, conventional mortgages were not available. So families, who in that case are non-white, were really forced into non-conventional credit markets in order to just survive.
In the United States, the vast majority of families that have built generational wealth have done it through real estate. When you don't have those opportunities, we just see this vast differentiation between those who were able to invest in real estate and those who are not. I think most people know about redlining as it was negatively impacting African Americans. But in fact, it did negatively impact other groups too. And so in San Antonio, we see that more clearly because San Antonio has such a large Mexican American population.
Although redlining defunded and divested in certain communities, really based on segregation, there was also another plan implemented too as well. There's racial covenants that in specific deeds, communities of color just couldn't live in there. It was illegal. Because of that, we start seeing the development of the suburban community, inner city communities, where mainly communities of color live. It kind of breeds a system to where civil rights activists are saying like, hey, we're looking in some places that we see specific inequality in. Education is one of them.
I would say education is one of the best ways to try to break through this economic segregation. When you think about where Texas A&M San Antonio is located on what had been Tejano Ranch lands, just to see that trajectory, it's really exciting. Could our ancestors have ever known we would have a university like that here?
Again, basically, the videos that you were shown that accompanied the article, it's amazing. There's some forms of redlining still used today. Now, again, just to reiterate everything, although it did primarily hit African Americans, there were Mongolians, Chinese, Turkish, Africans, other Middle Easterns, Italians. They couldn't get homes either, unless they went under the unconventional methods. But you see, if you look at redlining, everything was done by mapping, and they thought that minorities would bring the property value down. Now, if you think about it, I call them concentration camps. When public housing was built, that trapped a lot of African Americans. In fact, if you think about it, you've had cycles and cycles of African Americans and, of course, Hispanics and some whites, but I see it mainly in the urban areas with Blacks and Hispanics. They've had generations of people who live in public housing. And public housing brought nothing but poverty and crime. Now, of course, we know that drugs were put into the communities. We know that there was a lot of welfare in the communities. We know that some of these public housing facilities, they in my humble opinion, they weren't up to snuff with cleanliness. In fact, some of the famous public housing that I know, you had Murphy Homes in Baltimore. You had some in Chicago. In fact, if you go to every urban area, here's what you're going to see, and this is what brings the property value down until gentrification. See, this is what wasn't mentioned, but you can take some of those old homes and what did happen too, particularly in the African American community, and this is what I believe. Well, the individuals who did have housing in the African American community left the home for the kids. What did the kids do? They couldn't pay the taxes on it. So they left the homes. So what happened? The homes just sat there. They rotted. And this is where you had the urban blight, the boarded up home. This is where you had the hood. You didn't have anything in the hood, but maybe a corner grocery store with out-of-date food. The ghettos. Now, about the ghettos weren't started by Black people. I want you to understand that. You had a number of other immigrants that came over here from European countries like Ireland and England. They weren't African American. So everybody thinks it's Black people who started the ghettos. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. The bottom line with redlining, it was a discriminatory practice. Because when you use mapping to justify that you have African Americans who couldn't afford housing, well, they were shut out anyway because it was Jim Crow laws. I mean, but if you think about it, during Jim Crow laws, African Americans tried to build businesses. They got destroyed by lower class whites. So I will give African Americans credit. You know, and this is what's funny. When some of us cry about racism today, I've never even seen real racism. I haven't had to go out there and march. You had leaders who lobbied to get laws changed when it came to housing. And let me tell you something. Some of them took 20 years to change. Because with this redlining, the government was involved. In fact, the government encouraged the discrimination. Heck, they probably gave developers a big chunk of money. Now they're looking at the tax base because African Americans and Hispanics, they didn't have a lot of education. They didn't have the best of jobs. So if you think about it, that was all put in by design as well. Most of the African American, particularly men, they worked outside doing some labor work, and the women worked by cleaning houses of Caucasian folk. So of course, Blacks didn't have the resources that upper class whites did. In fact, Blacks weren't even allowed to move out to the suburbs. And that's discrimination. You had Levittown, and it really came prevalent when the housing boom and subdivisions became really popular after World War II. But again, redlining is a discriminatory practice. And believe it or not, it's still practiced today, I guarantee. Now, all I did was just give you an overview because a lot of it, and even I did not have the greatest understanding until I saw a couple of shows. I said, oh, okay, that's where they get redlining from. They took maps. They had maps of certain areas. And it wasn't just areas in the South. See, the number of individuals, might be going off topic a little bit when we talk about racism. Oh, there's a lot of northern races out here as well. They're just a little bit more silent about it. I mean, you look at Minnesota. See, it's not necessarily what you say, it's what you do, the practices. See, in the South, it was wide open. Well, in the North, you could pick it up if you were smart enough to pick it up. I know in Pennsylvania, still a lot going on there. Still a lot of bad practices going in some of these places. And this is why African Americans, and this is not crime victim, it's very hard to get ahead because we're in the system. Some people call it white supremacy. I call it classism because even some whites are shut out of it. See, the American dream, when you have a home, it's supposed to be part of the American dream. But I'm going to tell you something. When you have a 30-year loan, yeah, you can own the home, but you still got to pay taxes on the land that the home is on. So really, do you own the home? That's debatable. But when it came to redlining, when deeds specifically said that Negroes and Chinese, and Turkish, Mongolians, and Italians could not move in these neighborhoods. And I've done surveying, so I know what a warranty deed is. It lists the races word for word. If you don't believe me, pick up a warranty deed. Go to your courthouse. If you really want to get into this issue of redlining, go to the courthouse. Go to the office of the recorder, and you can pull up deeds. I know I've gone to the office of the recorder and picked up surveys from the 18 and 1900s. So what they basically did, they took developers, took parcels, divided them up. That's what a parcel is. But when it comes to redlining, understand it's really a discriminatory process to keep minorities out of the home buying business. See, because they want to make the minorities make payments. It's almost a rent to own type of situation. And it was very cowardly when the last payment was basically held because they really did not want minorities to own homes, period. They wanted them to stay in ghettos. And again, some of them did, some of them didn't. But in the meantime, want to know more about redlining? Just read about it. I'm just giving you an overview because it is very important that in order to move to the future, you got to understand the past. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some STEM content, in fact, I might tomorrow on my STEM channel talk about urban planning. Well, I'll also find a QCIS channel on YouTube as well. Every Thursday, for the most part, I do videos on that channel. Now, every time I upload videos from the 401 Talk Zone radio show and the QCIS channel, those videos are also presented on my Twitter page. Now, for the QCIS channel, since it is an educational channel, you can also find that channel on my LinkedIn page. And in the end, be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Always know that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. If it doesn't apply, let it fly. But if the shoe fits, wear it. If you don't like the shoe, change it. Once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful and gracious evening. Although I don't celebrate it, happy Valentine's Day to those who do celebrate it. And again, have a wonderful and gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.